Hi, everyone. My name is Teddy Davenport, and I'm a PhD candidate in geography at the University of Washington. My research focuses on transgender care practices, digital spaces, and disability justice. I'm really excited to talk with you all today about disability, geography, and immigration. And thanks so much to Dr. Guhlincozzi for inviting me to speak with you all today. To give a brief overview of how this presentation is going to look, first we're going to start off by defining disability before we go into part two, thinking about the ways that disability has been theorized and thought about in geography. And then in the final part, we're going to be thinking about spaces of disability and how space, disability, and immigration all relate to each other. So our first question that I think maybe would strike a few of us as a little bit odd, but what exactly is a disability? When I say the word, you might conjure up the image of a person in a wheelchair, or maybe think about developmental disabilities. Maybe you think about a veteran who became injured during war, or somebody who has depression, or is autistic, or is deaf or hard of hearing. The nature of disability is really vast, which makes it a little bit tricky to study. Disability studies scholars use a couple of different models to understand how society has understood the category of disability over history. So, the first model that disability scholars use to try and understand some of these historical ways that disability has been understood, first one is the charity model. This positions people with disabilities as being perpetually in need and being perpetually in needing of care, in particular, from people without disabilities. It understands disabled people as burdens on society, and it places churches and charities as the main experts on disabled people's needs. For disability study scholars, this is a pretty outdated model, although it's still often used today in some different aspects of the nonprofit world and some religious worlds. The next model is the medical model. And so this sees disability as a form of bodily impairment that requires medical intervention. Fundamentally, the medical model understands disability as a problem with an individual person's body that needs to be fixed. So under the medical model, it's medical professionals who are positioned as the main authorities on disabled people's needs. So this includes doctors, nurses, and public health officials. Again, for disability studies specifically, this is also considered an outdated model, but it is still widely used, particularly in a lot of medical research and in some parts of geography as well, as we'll see later on. The final model that disability studies scholars use when thinking about disability is the social model. So this comes out of the disability rights movements of the 1960s, and it understands disability as a structural and especially a spatial issue. The social model separates impairment from disability. The British Council of Organizations of Disabled People kind of does a really good job of doing this differentiation and says impairment is the functional limitation within the individual caused by physical, mental, or sensory impairment, whereas disability is a loss or limitation of opportunities to take part in the normal life of the community on an equal level with others due to physical and social barriers. So impairment is the thing that is going on in a person's body, whereas disability is the structural issue that's happening. The social model positions disabled people as experts of their own identity and experiences, and it also recognizes that not all people with disabilities need or want to be fixed, as the medical model usually presents disability. And one good example of this that's ongoing right now is the neurodivergence acceptance movement. So finally, let's talk a little bit about disability justice. Disability justice is not a model of disability per se, but it is an activist practice and a theoretical framework that was developed in the mid 2000s, created by and for disabled people of color and queer disabled people. I'm not going to go over all 10 of the disability justice principles because you can read it for yourself on the slide. But to do a quick overview, disability justice highlights how disability intersects with identities like race, sexuality, and gender. And it also emphasizes that the disability justice movement must be in solidarity with movements against sexism, racism, homophobia, etc. Disability justice also asserts the inherent worth of disabled people outside of their ability to produce under capitalism. And finally, disability justice emphasizes the interdependence of all people, not just those who are disabled. And it says that all people, regardless of their able status, require care, and interdependence is the way to move forward if we're to build movements for justice. All right, so next we're talking about disability and geography. So why is geography important to disability? For one example, I wanted to watch a quick video clip. We're not going to watch the full 9 minutes of this video, just the first 4 minutes or so, um, of this video clip on urban design that shows how ableism is often built into environments and what we can start to do to change it.
This video is sponsored by Brilliant.
As someone not living with a disability, it's pretty easy for me to get around city streets, even with ones with less than stellar pedestrian infrastructure. But put a stroller in my hands and an otherwise uneventful walk becomes an exercise in frustration as I have to navigate these tall curbs. All of a sudden I'm having to use driveways as curb ramps to avoid getting the kid up and down the curb every time. The truth is, not all pedestrian infrastructure is created equal. And in fact, some of it's so annoying it's like a toddler who just learned how to say no.
Do you want to ride in the stroller?
Yeah.
Can you please ride in the stroller?
Now, the obvious solution in my case would be to install curb ramps so people pushing strollers, people in wheelchairs or motorized scooters, or people who can't make that step can cross the street safely. But curb ramps won't solve every problem out there. Is it possible to design the perfect street? One where all users can feel comfortable and navigate it without safety concerns? This is the goal of universal design, and we'll learn about it more after the bike bell. Now, I started this video talking about my experiences pushing a stroller because one of the key tenets of universal design is that when you make these changes, it's great for everyone, not just for people who you think of as having traditional disabilities. This isn't just a discussion aimed at improving the lives of the 1.3 billion blind or low vision people in the world, or the 75 million who need a wheelchair, or the nearly 500 million people with a hearing disability. It's for everyone because we will all likely have experiences that will make us need a better designed pedestrian network. Maybe you'll push a stroller like me one day, or break a leg, or get old.
In the bad old days, universal design was not a consideration in many cities. In 1990, the Americans with Disability Act passed Congress and was signed by President Bush. It aimed to change that. Broadly speaking, it prohibits discrimination based on disability, particularly in the workplace. But Title II of the Act focuses on public entities. It requires public transportation and public spaces to accommodate people with disabilities. Since 1992, the federal government has published the ADA Standards for Accessible Design to help communities know how to design streets for people with disabilities. Other organizations have also published best practices for universal design, and these techniques and pieces of infrastructure continue to evolve and improve. So what are some of the best practices in universal design? Let's start with a simple city street. Sidewalks are the obvious piece of infrastructure here. How wide should they be? At minimum, suburban residential sidewalks should be 5 feet or 1.5 meters wide, and downtown sidewalks should be at least 14 feet or 4.2 meters wide. The wider the better is the rule of thumb to better accommodate users of all abilities and needs. For example, 7 or 8 feet of width is needed to accommodate 2 people signing a conversation while walking. Wider sidewalks also allow for people to move more slowly while faster walkers can pass by comfortably. Good streets also have places to sit. Everyone has experienced a moment on a walk where a bench would be really nice. Maybe you need to tie your shoe, take a rest, or do some people watching. Ideally, these places to sit would have arms to help people sit and stand more easily and have shade to protect them from the elements. Streets can be loud and busy and full of stimulus. It's important to have the occasional small, quiet, and enclosed area for stimulus-sensitive folks, such as neurodivergent people. It helps them take a break. Street trees and groups of benches can give people that respite. Lighting is critically important for most people, especially for those scared of the dark. More seriously, lighting can help people with low vision see where they're going and help deaf people sign clearly. This is a classic universal design example because while those with disabilities benefit, so too does basically everyone else. If you want a further discussion of street design, go check out a new video at PBS Terra. They profiled Atlanta, a place where there are not as many universal design streets as there needs to be. As a bonus, I make a cameo talking about how to design a car.
All right, so we can see from this video that there's a lot of different ways that geography is actually important to disability. And there's this discussion of universal design here shows the different ways that accessibility is important, not just for people who are disabled, but for everybody.
This video was sponsored.
Let's see. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the actual discipline of geography and how geography has thought about disability. Prior to the 1990s, there were really only two big ways that geographers thought about disability. The first was that a lot of people who made maps and a lot of cartographers were interested in making maps for people with visual impairments, starting in the 1960s. And we can see an example of sort of what a modern map for people with visual impairments looks like. You can see in this picture that it's a 3D printed map that is raised so that people with visual impairments can actually feel where all of the roads and the different buildings are. The second way that geographers have thought about disability prior to the 1990s, and really still, both of these are still continuing today, but these started before the 90s. But importantly is medical geography and spatial epidemiology, which started in the 70s and 80s. This field was interested in what's the spatial distribution of disability, what does disability look like geographically, and perhaps one that's a little bit more problematic, what environmental factors might be contributing to disability. This field has often been critiqued as positivist in that it really emphasizes that there is just one way to think about disability. It's very much invested in the medical model. And it was mostly focused on physical disabilities, sort of at the expense of thinking about any other kind of disability. This is definitely changing in medical geography today. And a lot of medical geography and spatial epidemiology today is starting to think more about disability justice. But when it was first really getting started during this era, maybe not so much. But so in the 1990s, with the popularization of the social model, geographers started thinking more about disability in space in ways other than just maps and other than just the medical landscape. And so thinking about the social model, geographers start to connect disability to capitalism and think about the ways that spaces like the factory and the city are structured around able people's experiences and really not designed at all for people with disabilities. And geographers are also starting to think about the ways that disability is produced through spaces like the factory and the city. Also importantly during this time, women and female geographers play a very important role in paving the way and connecting disability to gender and embodiment. Particularly, Isabel Dick starts to write about critical perspectives on women with multiple sclerosis and other chronic disabilities, and thinking about their personal experience, which wasn't really something that medical geographers had done in the past. Also, very importantly, Vera Chouinard, in the late 90s, starts writing about her personal experiences as a disabled woman experiencing discrimination in her geography department, starting in the late 90s. So not only do we have people who are starting to think about disability and space in different ways, but we also have people who are starting to think about the field of geography itself and starting to critique the ways that the field perpetuates ableism. So now we're in sort of a second wave of critical disability geographies. One of the big things that's come out of this wave of critical disability geographies is a new model called the relational model. And so the relational model was created in response to criticisms about the social model being too deterministic. Um, and so this theoretical perspective thinks about the social model as sort of being predeterministic, and it critiques this model for saying, well, it's saying that, for example, the factory or the city is automatically exclusionary and oppressive for people with impairments. But that's not necessarily true, and it encourages us to think more closely about the different contexts that people engage and perform embodiment and disability and transform their environments. So this also continues, this wave continues work on thinking about disability in the field of geography and disability research, or geographic research, excuse me. We also see a continued emphasis that Verschoonard had started on autoethnographic methods and thinking about sort of being self-reflexive on the ways that we understand disability in our departments. Also during this wave, there's a lot of different things going on, so this is sort of just a short overview. But autistic geographies and ecologies are a growing field in this area. And thinking about the different ways that people who have sensory impairments or are neurodivergent think about spaces. And then the final thing that I'll talk about for this wave is the geopolitics of disability. And in particular, we'll talk later about the geopolitics of asylum and immigration. One thing to note about this wave is that disability geographies was and continues to be a very white field, and it needs to be still needs to be addressed. There needs to be more attentiveness to race and non-U.S. geographies and non-global North geographies, but definitely there's a lot of exciting stuff that's going on in this field. And so this last part that we're going to talk about is disability geography and immigration. And I wanted to introduce this term, able nationalism. Able nationalism is the degree to which treating people with disabilities as an exception valorizes able-bodied norms of inclusion as a naturalized qualification of citizenship. What does that mean? Able nationalism, without reading from a quote, basically means that people who are able-bodied or don't have disabled are treated as the norm for trying to get citizenship. And it understands disability sort of as an outside factor, and usually disability is not factored into the way that people think about immigration, particularly today. In the early US immigration laws, however, disability or able nationalism was thought of a little bit more explicitly. The very first federal immigration law in the US, the Act of 1882, prohibited entry to any, quote, lunatic, idiot, or any person unable to take care of himself or herself without becoming a public charge. And here, idiot actually has a legal definition. It's not just the person who, I don't know, says weird stuff in your class about conspiracy theories or whatever. During this time, an idiot refers to somebody who is, this is Merriam-Webster historical definition, those so defective that the mental development never exceeds that of a normal child of about 2 years old. So again, idiot, lunatic, these are legal definitions. In 1907, entry was denied to anyone judged mentally or physically defective, such as mental or physical defect being of a nature which may affect the ability of such alien to earn a living. We also see prior to this in 1903, people with epilepsy were denied entry. And in 1917, the medical causes for exclusion under immigration really expanded a lot and included arthritis, asthma, bunions, deafness, deformities, poor eyesight, many, many, many things, which made it very easy to actually deny a lot of people immigration. So what are some of the things that we notice here? First, we can kind of see a shift away from the charity model, where we see concern over disabled people becoming burdens on society, but under the charity model, disabled people are to be cared for by able-bodied people. We're not saying that so much anymore. Rather, disability is becoming entangled with capitalism, and the concern about being a burden on society is more focused on sort of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and making sure that everybody is independent. Um, this also wasn't really explicitly said in the immigration laws, but disability was used to justify racism in immigration a lot. And there were stereotypes of, these are direct quotes, the slow-witted Slav or the neurotic condition of our Jewish immigrants. So in a lot of cases, disability is also entangled with race and ethnicity, and particularly racial and ethnic stereotypes. So next, I want to just talk a little bit about asylum in the US and the ways that asylum is tied to disability. There's a lot of misinformation about how asylum is supposed to work, so I wanted to do a really quick overview. After World War II, the United Nations was established and created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is a set of international rights that everyone is supposed to follow. Um, Article 14 says everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. So, in order to gain a permanent asylum status, you have to prove that you are fleeing persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And that is based off of that is US law. The US passed its own federal law in the Refugee Act of 1980. It uses that exact language about fleeing persecution on account of these five factors. So for most of the latter half of the 20th century, the way that you try and start an asylum claim is that you enter the US or a port of entry. You start an asylum claim by saying, I am fleeing from, I'm experiencing persecution or have a well-founded fear of persecution based off of race, religion, nationality, etc. You start the asylum claim. You're allowed to live in the US. You're supposed to be allowed to live in the US with a family or sponsor while the asylum case is being decided in immigration court. And then you're supposed to be able to go to immigration court and like your asylum case gets decided whether or not you actually like are whether or not they agree that you are fleeing persecution. So under U.S. and international law, asylum seekers are not supposed to be detained. They're not supposed to be in detention centers, and they have the right to stay in the U.S. without fear of deportation while their case is being decided. I'm using a lot of should and supposed to be because a lot of this is not happening today. There have been a lot of changes to U.S. asylum practices in the last couple of decades, but one or a couple of the most significant ones have been since the start of the Trump administration. So the Trump administration, in particular, introduced two big changes. The Migration Protection Protocol, which is colloquially known as the Remain in Mexico Act, started in January 2019, and it required migrants seeking asylum to stay in Mexico until their immigration court date, which, as we established from the last slide, is not really how asylum is supposed to work. If you're fleeing persecution, you don't stay in the country, like in one of the countries where you are fleeing persecution. And in March 2020, Trump administration implemented a public health rule during COVID-19 to turn away asylum seekers at the border without giving them a chance to present their case for asylum. Which again is something that really goes against international law. The US also has a waiver to exempt disabled asylum seekers from language and civic requirements. So for the very few people who were able to try and seek asylum during this time, under the Trump administration, this application became a lot more complex. It also it nearly doubled in length from 12 to 23 questions, and it also added a number of questions about illegal drug usage. So the rate of denial greatly increased during this time as the form faced extra scrutiny, and there began to be a new discourse around disability and sort of this idea of the disability con that the public is trying to defraud, or that people seeking asylum are trying to defraud the American public by pretending to be disabled. Um, so since the Trump administration, things have not really gotten much better. The act that, or the Title 42 that said that people could be turned away as a result of the pandemic got lifted, but this was almost immediately replaced by the Biden administration last year by a requirement that migrants book an asylum interview using a mobile app before entering the U.S. Um, a lot of immigration rights advocates have more or less said that this is an asylum, another way of banning asylum. This is another way of making it very, very, very difficult for people to try and seek asylum. Um, so this asylum ban bars asylum seekers who cross through another country on their way to the southern U.S. border, unless they have previously applied for and been denied asylum elsewhere, or if they've managed to receive an appointment at a port of entry through this mobile app. So the idea of having a mobile app that you have to have that requires a smartphone usage and a data plan for people who are fleeing persecution is kind of laughable in the first place, right? If you're trying to flee persecution, probably trying to hang onto a smartphone and like pay for internet access is not the first thing on your mind. Unfortunately, the app is also very inaccessible for people who are disabled, and it has a lot of problems. First, it requires very high levels of technological literacy and fine motor skills. It also uses facial recognition technology to log in, and studies have found that this app and the facial recognition technology misidentifies people with dark skin a lot more than people with lighter skin, um, which means that in terms of race, there's a lot of problems going on where it's not identifying a lot of people who are like racially understood as Black. For a very long time, the app was only available in English and Spanish. Haitian Creole recently got added, but previously Haitians had made up about 80% of asylum speakers, and Haitian Creole, which is the national language of Haiti, was not an app option. So now there are three options, English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole, but this is still not great, but since there are a lot of people who don't speak any one of those three languages. It's also been a lot more difficult for families to get appointments versus individuals. And so this affects people with higher care needs, such as children, elderly, and disabled people. When an entire family can't get an asylum status, a lot of times families will try and just like see whether or not they can get an appointment for individual people and hope that others will be able to come later and get appointments later. Finally, it's been a lot more difficult for non-governmental organizations that help asylum seekers, since the data has to come from an individual's app. It's a lot more difficult for these NGOs to help people fill out information if they're having difficulties filling it out. So the longer that people have to wait for an appointment, the more likely they are to return to circumstances that are bad. And as geographers such as Jen Lloyd remind us, disability and impairment are produced geopolitically in the entanglement of war, displacement, refugee administration, and naturalization. So there's a lot of ways that disability is tied to immigration historically, but is also tied to the way that we understand immigration and asylum today. So here's our works cited. You can pause here if you wanted to take a closer look at any of these readings. But I just wanted to end by saying thank you again for inviting me to come speak with you. And if you have any questions about this presentation, please feel free to reach out to me at tsdav@uw.edu. Thank you so much.